Europe's energy independence. Trading Moscow for Houston. On October 23, 2025, EU diplomats in Brussels toasted mineral water, celebrating the 19th sanctions package, banning Russian LNG imports by the end of 2026, severing Moscow's leverage after 3 years of wartime energy trauma. Yet in Washington, Treasury officials opened champagne. Over 50 billion euros annually flowing from Brussels to Houston. This is the paradox of Europe's energy liberation. The continent's most assertive act of economic statecraft since the Cold War may ultimately replace one dependency with another, swapping Russian pipeline coercion for American export conditionality. The numbers tell an uncomfortable story. The trade data was already revealing the shift. During the first half of 2025, American liquefied natural gas supplied 27% of the European Union's total gas imports. More striking still, U.S. exports represented 55% of all LNG coming into Europe. American officials project these figures will climb to between 40 and 50% by 2027. While European leaders spoke publicly about strategic autonomy, their purchasing managers were quietly signing long-term contracts that would bind the continent's industrial base to American export terminals for decades to come. The arithmetic is inexorable. The European Union's renewable energy push will offset only 20 to 25% of demand by 2028. Mediterranean infrastructure remains constrained to between 20 and 30 billion cubic meters per year. Someone has to fill the vacuum left by Russian exit, a gap of 75 to 85 billion cubic meters annually. That someone increasingly is America. The shadow fleet reveals the limits. Yet Europe hasn't achieved a clean break from Russia either. Despite 9 comprehensive sanctions packages, European Union member states paid Russia 938 million euros for fossil fuels in October 2025 alone. The shadow fleet tells this uncomfortable truth. Reslag tankers, shell companies routing payments through third countries, ship-to-ship transfers in international waters. These evasion tactics sustain flows equal to 10 to 15% of pre-war volumes. This persistent leakage means Brussels has achieved neither full Russian decoupling nor genuine diversification. Instead, Europe finds itself caught between 2 dependencies, vulnerable to pressure from both Moscow and Washington. The question is no longer whether Europe will be dependent, but on whom and at what strategic cost. How we got here. The path to this predicament began with a series of escalating decisions. On January 1, 2025, Ukraine terminated Russian gas transit through its territory, removing 40 billion cubic meters per year of capacity in a single stroke. That represented 40% of remaining Russian flows. By May, the European Commission had published its phase-out roadmap. Russian gas still comprised 13% of imports at that baseline, but Brussels was determined to eliminate it entirely. The diplomatic choreography accelerated through the fall. On October 20th, the Council agreed its regulatory position. 2 days later, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned Lukoil and Rosneft, blocking a $22 billion asset sale. By November 6th, Gunvor had abandoned its Lukoil acquisition under sanctions pressure. 10 days later, Greece and Ukraine signed an LNG deal promising 5 to 10 billion cubic meters of seasonal capacity. Each sanctions package operated on a simple theory. Regulatory compulsion plus infrastructure cutoff equals supply substitution. The 19th package added enforcement teeth through pure entry bans and financial transaction blocks, aiming for a 90% reduction by the end of 2026. Yet the shadow fleet's persistence revealed the limits of this approach. The International Energy Agency confirms that 10 to 15% of oil and gas flows continue reaching European markets despite sanctions, reducing the effective Russian reduction to between 75 and 85%. The Mediterranean pivot. While Atlantic shipping routes dominated headlines, European strategists quietly shifted focus to the Mediterranean. Algeria's Transmed pipeline, operating at 30 billion cubic meters capacity through Sicily, emerged as Brussels' preferred redundancy route for southeastern Europe. Greece's Alexandroupolis floating storage and regasification unit terminal, scheduled to receive first cargoes in December 2025, promised to enable reverse flows to Ukraine through the Black Sea. These projects reflected calculated hedging, maintain access to non-Russian gas, while avoiding complete dependence on transatlantic shipments. But geography imposes harsh constraints. Weather windows for Strait of Sicily operations are restrictive from October to April. Storm risks delay 20% of throughput during winter months. The Sicily choke point vulnerability delays 20% of throughput from October to April, creating winter price spikes precisely when demand peaks. Hydrogen blending technology remains at only 60% readiness, limiting future-proofing options. Without €500 million in terminal upgrades, effective Mediterranean capacity drops from 30 billion cubic meters to between 15 and 25 billion per year. Transmission losses across the European grid average 10 to 15%, further limiting substitution potential. The actual infrastructure can serve Greece, Bulgaria, and Romania effectively, but it cannot reach Germany, Italy, or Poland, the European Union's three largest gas consumers. Those countries will remain dependent on Atlantic routes, which means American suppliers. The renewable energy shortfall. The European Union's renewable energy program was conceived as the long-term solution to import dependency. Repower EU's roadmap projects renewables offsetting 20 to 25% of gas demand by 2028, with targets of 70% low-carbon electricity by 2030. The potential certainly exists. The Iberian Peninsula has 200 gigawatts of untapped solar capacity. The North Sea offers 50 gigawatts of wind potential. Yet deployment velocity tells a sobering story. The program requires between 25 and 30 gigawatts per year of new renewable capacity to achieve its targets. Actual commissioning in 2024 and 2025 averaged only 18 gigawatts per year, a 40% shortfall. This gap represents precisely the demand that American LNG exporters are banking on filling. The €300 billion REPower EU budget could accelerate deployment to 35 gigawatts per year if grid bottleneck investments increase by 30%. But that funding has not materialized. European capitals face competing demands for defense spending and industrial subsidies. The political will to invest in energy independence at the required scale remains elusive. America's strategic opportunity. The American diplomatic offensive in late October 2025 was remarkably explicit. Treasury officials touring European capitals stated their goal to eliminate every last molecule of Russian gas, a message backed by compelling market data. At projected 2026 through 2027, European Union gas import volumes of 120 billion cubic meters per year. American capture of 40 to 50% market share translates to between 48 and 60 billion cubic meters. At current spot prices, that generates between 52 and 65 billion euros in annual revenue. Washington faces some headwinds. European Union methane regulations threaten to block 10% of U.S. LNG shipments that fail emission certification. domestic American permitting delays have stalled 15 billion cubic meters per year of new export capacity originally scheduled for 2026. Mediterranean alternatives could divert 8 to 12 billion cubic meters if Algeria and Qatar finalize supply agreements. Yet these constraints merely trim the edges of American dominance. Probability-adjusted models suggest market share will stabilize between 35 and 45%, still representing 45 to 55 billion euros in annual revenue transfer from European consumers to American exporters. The U.S. Atlantic route from Gulf Coast terminals to Rotterdam transits in 15 to 20 days, with 100 billion cubic meters per year of capacity. It's reliable, scalable, and politically aligned with European security interests. Washington's leverage will extend far beyond energy. Future trade negotiations, defense procurement decisions, and technology transfer agreements will all occur in the shadow of European energy dependence on American supplies. 3 trigger events. The final equilibrium depends on 3 interconnected trigger events. First, Ukraine receives its first Greek LNG cargoes in mid-December 2025. There's a 70% probability this happens on schedule. If the Alexandroupolis terminal operates as planned, southeastern Europe secures winter supply and Russian leverage drops 15% overnight. But Sicily storm delays could reduce this benefit by 20%, while Black Sea naval mines increase transit risk. Second, the European Union enforces its spot Russian gas ban in mid-January 2026. This has a 60% probability. A resulting price spike of 15% would accelerate U.S. LNG contract lock-in, as buyers rush to hedge against volatility. Mediterranean alternatives could gain 8 to 12 billion cubic meters if Algeria increases Transmed flow, but American permitting delays might offset this by blocking 15 billion cubic meters of new capacity. Third, the U.S.-EU methane dispute escalates in the first quarter of 2026. This carries a 40% probability. Brussels methane regulations threaten to block 10% of U.S. LNG shipments, failing emission certification. If the United States challenges European methane caps at the World Trade Organization, the dispute could bifurcate the market, pushing Washington toward Qatar and Algeria instead. Best case and worst case. In the best case scenario, American market share stabilizes at 35%. Mediterranean capacity reaches 25 billion cubic meters effective. And Repower EU accelerates to 30 gigawatts per year. The result would be 45 billion euros in annual revenue transfer, residual Russian flows below 5%, and southeastern European autonomy. Achieving this requires Brussels to execute long-term contracts with Algeria, increase Repower EU funding by 90 billion euros, and invest 500 million euros in Sicily regasification expansion. The worst case sees American capture reach 50%. Methane disputes block 10% of shipments, forcing emergency Qatar purchases at premium prices, and shadow fleet operations sustain 15% Russian flows. The outcome would be 65 billion euros in transfers, fractured EU-US relations, and Central European vulnerability to American political cycles. A future Republican administration in Washington could condition LNG shipments on defense spending commitments or technology transfer restrictions, creating a new form of energy conditionality that Moscow never possessed in such pure form. The paradox of liberation. Europe's energy liberation carries a profound irony. By December 2026, Brussels will have eliminated most Russian molecules, but locked in more than 50 billion euros in annual payments to American exporters. The continent will have replaced pipeline coercion with Atlantic conditionality. Washington's methane regulations, domestic permitting politics, and trade negotiations will now shape European industrial competitiveness in ways Moscow could only dream of. This dependency carries novel risks. A future American administration could leverage energy supplies for concessions on defense procurement, technology transfer, or market access. The shadow fleet's persistence proves that sanctions cannot achieve 100% decoupling. What Europe must do, the prescription is threefold. First, diversify away from U.S. LNG dependency by executing long-term contracts with Algeria and Qatar to reduce the American share from 55% to below 40% by 2027. This could save 15 billion euros annually. Second, accelerate REPowerEU deployment from 18 gigawatts per year to 30 gigawatts per year through 90 billion euros in grid bottleneck resolution. This would offset an additional 10 billion cubic meters by 2028. Third, upgrade Mediterranean choke points with 500 million euros to expand Sicily regasification and install hydrogen conversion at Alexandroupolis, boosting effective capacity from 18 to 28 billion cubic meters per year. Without these steps, Europe's energy independence will prove a Pyrrhic victory. Liberated from Russia, but captured by America, the continent's most assertive act of economic statecraft since the Cold War risks creating a new dependency that may prove just as constraining, if less overtly hostile, than the one it replaced. The toasts in Brussels last October were premature. True energy sovereignty requires not just severing one dependency, but building genuine alternatives. Europe has won its freedom from Moscow. Whether it can maintain its autonomy from Washington remains the defining question of the next decade.